Afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar on breaking the stigma of men and mental health. I think this is a crucial topic that affects not only men, but also their families, their workplaces and communities. And I think by addressing the stigma surrounding mental health, we can create an environment that encourages open dialogue and allowing men to seek help without the fear of being judged. We are very fortunate today to have two outstanding speakers with us, Ernesto and Tatuatsi. Both are treatment professionals, skilled counselors, and life coaches who specializes in personal development and emotional intelligence. And we want to encourage you to engage, ask questions in the chat box, and take away valuable tools to help foster an environment where mental health is normalized and prioritized for all. So without any further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Ernesto and Tatuatsi. Apologies. Tatu.
Perfect.
Over to you.
Thank you so much for having us. A lovely presentation introduction, Diesel. Thank you so very much. Again, indeed, welcome and thank you for joining us on our talk about breaking the stigma of mental health in men. I'm joined by my co-presenter, Tato Hatsi. Just before we switch over, I myself, I'm a registered counselor with Ask Nelson. I also have a master's degree in psychology. And I love what I do, if we could put it gently.
Lovely.
Over to you, Tato.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so lovely to be a part of this conversation today. We've been looking forward to having it. And yes, like Ernesto said, my name is Tato. I am a social worker by profession. A lot of my background is in medical social work and, of course, in EAP as well. Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. Like Liesel said, feel free to chip in into the conversation. Tell us what you're thinking around all the themes we're going to be covering today. Let it not be a dialogue just between myself and Ernesto, but let's talk. Have you
Absolutely.
experienced some of the things that we are going to be talking about today? Do you have a family member you think is experiencing some of these things? Let's have a dialogue together. And yeah, over to you,
Absolutely.
Ernesto.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Tato. The door is wide open for us to engage.
Definitely.
So let's start by unpacking, or how do we say, setting the tone with a little bit of a narrative or a little bit of a story between a 10-year-old boy or a little boy and a wise man. I want us to imagine those two as the characters. Just for a little bit more context, the wise man used to previously be a warrior. We're setting ourselves somewhere in the past. This warrior used to historically shower the children of the village that he lives in with stories about his accomplishments, his adventures, the beasts that he's overcome, wars he may have fought, trolls that he took down under the bridge, and so forth. But this boy that we're discussing has different interests than the norm. He's more interested in the why rather than the what, if we could put it that way as well. The boy one day decided to join the old man by a tree. And as he made his way up to the lonely tree at the top of the hill, for us to imagine it, I want us to picture a lonelier man and a curious child. Right? So they sat in silence for a little bit before the boy, while the boy was picking up grass and playing and so forth, the wise man asked him, "Don't you want to hear one of my stories?" The boy says, "Yes, I do, but not the ones that you tell the village all the time. I want to hear about your failures, your friends, who you were as a person. What were your fears, for instance?" They sat in silence again for a bit. There was a bit of confusion in the air, and the man presented to the boy that not so much who he is, but what he has done is the rhetoric of his legacy, what he is leaving behind for the world. At this point, the boy starts to challenge this rhetoric, and it asks that to be like you is great and awesome and it's inspiring, but we don't know who you were, so how can we be like you in that sense? The man again explains that who I am is not so much as rather what I did, and that is how you tend to emulate me. The little boy poses a question, though, to the man. He says, "I'm posing this question to you not to the warrior that you were.
Mm,
I want to find out things like what are the hardest things you've ever had to do? After some silence, the man admits that admitting that I'm scared is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. A follow-up question came with the boy asking, what is it that you fear the most in that case? And again, after some silence and maybe a few tears and emotions, the wise man says, having to ask for help. Let's see if anybody can resonate with this rhetoric or with this story. Let's see if you maybe have any kind of experiences akin to this on your own, maybe in our childhood or throughout life, based on the people that we've interacted with. But it does show that this
mm.
has been a long time coming. The conversation of who I am rather than what I've done tends to be quite a narrative among men.
That's
So,
true, Ernesto. And just if I can chip in there a little bit, we also just see how, how you are identified, or rather how a man is identified by their society can become easily internalized. We see how he sticks to saying, he describes himself according to the things that he has done or accomplished, as opposed to his fears or any vulnerabilities. Do you know what I mean? So
mhm.
he has internalized it and made it sort of an identity due to
Uh-huh.
how he is seen by society. I think that is quite intricate.
Yeah, quite an overreaching aspect or facet of
Mm-hmm.
manhood, if we can put it that way. To further, how do we say, clarify the precarious nature of what we're discussing, let's have a look at some of the stats or facts about men and mental health, specifically in South Africa. As we can see on the slide, the first point mentions that South Africa is ranked 10th on the list of countries with the highest suicide rates. And to further elucidate, out of 13,774 suicides reported in South Africa, 10,861 were among men. We also understand that men are less likely to seek help due to fears of being perceived as weak or unmanly. This has been well described in the literature along the lines of men's help seeking behaviors, which is markedly different from women's as well. Something else for us to take into account is the fact that symptoms and depression generally manifest and appear differently between men and women, including, for instance, irritability, anger, and risk taking behavior, particularly not reserved but prominent among men as opposed to women. This can then have a knock on effect when it comes to undiagnosed or underdiagnosed mental health challenges for men, and furthermore, untreated mental health conditions that slip through the cracks. A fourth point for us to take into account is the cultural expectations that sometimes discourage men from expressing vulnerability or seeking help, as we may have mentioned. It's exacerbated by the hegemonic masculine norm that equates masculinity with emotional suppression. That hegemonic masculine norm is the stereotypical, traditional, we could call it, I don't want to say aggressive, but rough and tough portrayal of
Mm,
masculinity.
mm.
Men are less likely to seek then help due to fears of being perceived as less manly, or as in feminine or weak or emasculine, or any of these ways. Well,
That's
how
true.
do we resonate with this? So do we have any comments that are coming through?
Yeah. I see we have a couple of comments actually, Ernesto. As Pew is saying, I am not a man, but in my whole life, I've never heard my brothers ask for help. Yeah. And she also says, I can't help but wonder what it would take to create that safe space as a woman. That's so true.
Hmm.
Men are not socialized. They are not socialized to ask for help or to be seen in a vulnerable state. So you're right, Spiwe. They perhaps are just taking up the identity, or just taking up the expectation as per the society. And just regarding the stats, Ernesto, we see that the rate of suicide in men is multiplied compared to that of women. And so we see the necessity of having such a conversation, the necessity
Absolutely.
of having such open spaces and safe environments to have such conversations, because it is a growing pandemic, so to say,
Hmm. Absolutely. I like how you equate that to the urgency, for instance, that it requires.
Mm,
Absolutely. Let's have a look see at again further highlight the nature of what we're discussing. I want us to present the following video, but let's just brace ourselves as possible. It's a little bit strong as a disclaimer or a heads up. Let's see
Yes.
how what we can pull from it.
Is the audio fine? I don't think I can
Anesta,
hear.
there's no sound on this side.
Hmm.
How can I stop the sharing and turn it on again?
Yes, thank you.
How do I include the now? Right, let me know if we have sound.
Not yet.
Do we have video?
There is video, no sound, and I think
No
everyone
sound.
in the chat is also agreeing with us.
All right.
Hmm.
Sorry. Aha. Let me try this one more time. So let's turn that off. Let's turn the screen share on again. Let's click the presentation. There's no sound or any kind of thing for sound. I'm wondering if I must maybe share my entire screen, if that's all right. Right. Do we have visual?
There's visual,
Do we have sound?
no sound still. Hmm.
All right. One last time.
Okay.
No.
So, Ernest, I think what we can do is so this session is recorded, we will upload it onto the Kala website and we will then just give you access to this video as well. Apologies for the technical errors on our side. But Ernest, if you can maybe just talk us through this video and then we will make the video available as part of the toolkits when we upload the recording. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the understanding, guys. Apologies again.
Yeah.
Just as a little briefing on our video, the video starts posing the men that we see the question, have we ever considered or have you ever considered taking your own life? Which is
Hmm.
quite a heavy question, as we can see through a lot of phases. Some people say no, a lot of people say no, some people say yes, some people are open to talk about it, some people are not. Some people experience this in childhood, some people experience this because of a variety of different reasons. But the understanding that we get from this is that it's okay to normalize the conversation. It doesn't mean that
Hmm.
there's anything wrong with us. It doesn't mean that I like how the last participant in the video mentions it's okay to have experienced some down moments. It's okay to experience mental health difficulties. It doesn't mean anything about you. It doesn't mean that you're broken or incompetent or less manly. It just means that you've been through some stuff, if that makes sense. And that's a brilliant way to put it.
Hmm. But it also, I think, and if I can come in there, I think there's something that it highlights that, mental health issues affect men across all races,
Mm,
across all sexual orientation, and it is a human struggle, and it's not necessarily for a specific type of person, even across socioeconomic backgrounds. I think it does highlight that as well quite vividly because you can see the people in the video are very, very different, but it shows that they experience vulnerability as well.
absolutely, absolutely indeed. Great eye. And to add to that, something that the video highlights for us is that as much as it is a sensitive topic for us to discuss, we tend to open up when given the platform to do so. When we're asked, for instance, Mm. It's one of the things of
Yeah,
men, if
that
we could
is
put it like
true. I was talking to my dad and my cousin the other day, and just leading up to this conversation, just trying to get a feel of where their head is at. And how they were just openly sharing with me showed that when given the platform and when given the safe space, men are likely to share what is going on with them. Do you know what I mean? So perhaps
that.
as a society, we haven't necessarily created these safe spaces or are not being intentional, probably as the women counterpart,
Mm.
maybe creating more of these spaces, then men can feel free to share how they're feeling. We have some comments. I wonder if I can go through them, Ernesto.
Absolutely.
We have a lot of comments in the chat here. Um, okay, those are about sound. Let me scroll a little bit. Barry says vulnerability and authenticity are perceived as weakness when they in fact take courage and are strength. That is such
Mm,
a good way to look at it, Barry. And we will,
absolutely.
I think we'll touch base into something around those themes later on in the presentation as well, in the webinar. And then Peter says, I have overcome some stuff. It's not easy for men to share what society or the world in general is seen as weak. Oh, thank you so much for your vulnerability, Peter.
That hits
Um,
home. It really does.
yeah, thank you very, very much for your vulnerability. It's men like you who model this type of behavior and come out and talk about it so openly that make other men, have the bravery as well. It has to become a norm in society, and not so much this thing that is so bad for men to do. Peter also says creating a comfortable space for men to share is good, and I totally agree. Okay, we're getting into this question slide. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Please
we're
take it away.
posing. Thank you. We really wanted to pose these questions to you as our. We wanted to pose these questions to you as our audience. Maybe just sit with these questions and think about them a little bit throughout the webinar. Um, and just do you know a male figure in your life that is struggling with their mental health? Just I'm going to let it sit in there for a little bit. Do you know how the men in your life are really doing currently? When last
Good
have you
question.
checked in with the men in your life? If I could pose the question to the both of us as well, for myself, leading up to, okay, working in the space that I work in, of course, I work with a lot of men, but just leading up to the webinar, I've been quite intentional with checking in with the men around me. And like I shared, when given the space, I found that it was eye-opening and encouraging to see that they felt safe to share how exactly they felt with me. What has been your experience in this, too?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. All of
Mm,
these questions resonate. For instance, I'm privy to one or two of my male friends who are going through some difficulties in their life. With regards to that second question, do I know how they really are doing? Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
mm,
We don't know what we don't know or what we don't share. But I think based on, like you mentioned, the nature of the work that we do, Tata, we're a little bit more
mm,
privy. If so, and that
yeah.
applies more to the last question. When last do we check in with the men in our life? I like to think that pretty often or regularly. Um,
Mm.
and
And you know
that,
how
that,
the
like we said, might just be personal or my own side.
Yes. And I think the second question could also just to highlight it a bit. You know how
Hmm.
you could be asking someone how they're doing and they give you the generic I'm okay and you?
Hmm.
Some people, especially men, because it's not the expectation for a man to kind of now divulge and open up about maybe how they're feeling. I suppose you want to ask more than once so that you can communicate your intention to them and just be like, how are you really doing?
That is
Also, I want to pose it to everyone. When you do ask the question, are you asking it generically or are you asking it with intention as well? Are you trying to find out in passing or are you trying to find out intentionally as well? Just wanted to
very good
emphasize
question.
that.
Very,
Mm,
very good question, actually. I agree also. I admit I catch myself doing that, how do we say that, scripted response. When somebody
yes.
asks me how I'm doing, I'm fine, can't complain, as much as I can. And as much as I'm not so fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Food for thought. Brilliant. Thank you
Maybe
so
let's
much.
go through more questions a little bit because I feel like they're flooding in. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Do we have more questions?
Yeah, we do. No, not
By all
questions per
means.
se, but
Comments.
comments.
By all means.
I see Katleho Sikoma is saying, I think men fear sharing as they think that whatever. Oh, they're coming in quite a bit. Okay. I think men fear sharing as they think that whatever is said will be used against them. Yeah. Goes back
Mhm.
to that vulnerability conversation. A man can't be seen in quote unquote being weak. And Michaela says, how does one get men to open up or create a safe space?
Good
Mm,
question. I think there might be some insight into that question that comes um, throughout the rest of the presentation. One of them is to provide the
mm,
space. One of them is to query again, even though they say like we touched base on. There might
mm,
also be a point of or a part of showing or normalizing the conversation, that we can have this conversation and nothing will stop being the same for you. You'll still be a man, you'll still be
yes,
masculine, you'll still be strong, but we can have
absolutely.
vulnerability without exclusivity. Brilliant.
Absolutely, you're rhyming there. It is. I have another comment. Caesar says, I'm glad that you touched on the point about creating intentional, safe spaces for men. It's indeed an area where, as society, we're currently lacking. Yeah. And I suppose we
Absolutely.
could have conversations all day, but are we actually, creating this in space in our corners intentionally? And then Pure also says, I recently came to the realization that I talk so much when I'm with my partner that he hardly gets a chance to get in a word. I am now intentional about listening and holding space for him, and he actually has a lot to say. Oh,
Mhm.
that's
It's very
very
sensitive,
insightful.
but very insightful as well.
Thank
Absolutely.
you so much for sharing that. Just one more comment. Men need, okay, Innocent Mzuu says, men need someone as a partner whom they can confide in, someone who will not use their weakness against them. That is very true. That
Mm,
safe space can be a person. That's
absolutely.
actually really true, innocent.
Sometimes relationships can provide that space, or they serve as the starting block or the learning point for how we use that space. That rings home again, very true, very
Mm,
relevant. But like
yeah.
Tato says, I think we can unpack the topic for days. In fact, I think it requires more than one presentation, but let's work with what we have, if that's all right. So one of the questions, quite a big one, is how did we get to this point where men are marginalized, if we could put it that way, in a greater
Mm,
society? Well, some of them are, or some of these reasons are on screen at the moment, and they center around the different stigmas that we experience at different levels, both socially, within ourselves, culturally or societally, and uh, globally, if we could put it, as a masculine kind of stereotype, or a masculine, that hegemonic masculinity that we brought up a little bit earlier on.
mm,
So to touch base on social stigma, besides the explanation that's on screen for us, I want us to consider an example, if that's all right. Say, for instance, I'll use myself for the sake of the example to not tread on anybody's toes, but say that I've now been diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder, previously
mm,
or traditionally, historically known as multiple personalities or split personality disorder, and I disclose this with one of my friends. Now, my friend might respond like, "Oh man, what if one of your personalities goes on a killing spree? Or what if one of your personalities does X and you wouldn't even know about it?" Now, that might be a very heavy comment, but it comes
mm,
from a place of misunderstanding, if that's all right. This is what society perpetuates from, for instance, the media, or from portrayals of either masculinity or mental health, for that matter.
yeah.
Mm, does
In the
anybody have
past,
any other? Oh, sorry. Yes, Tato?
mm, and I suppose, it's also in history, and how mental health was depicted in history was not very educational or very empowering either. It was seen as a negativity in society to have a mental illness.
Mm,
You were then marginalized from the community. So I think also the miseducation and misinterpretation from your friend, for example, could come a lot from how mental illness has been depicted in society historically, but
historically.
it's very, very problematic, because it then creates an idea about mental illness which is very false.
Hmm. This also touches base, Tato, as you mentioned now, on a mistrust of the healthcare system by men, which has also traditionally been the case. But I think
mm,
we'll come to that moving forward. I think in one of our
mm,
in our further slides. The next point I want us to look at regards self-stigma, which is the stigma that we ourselves feel as we go through the difficulties that we go through. It can make it difficult to address the difficulties themselves, the stigma on its own, but they can then compound the situation because we don't, for instance, reach out for assistance based on how we perceive or how we feel, what we think, what we believe, and that then exacerbates what we might be going through, for instance. Just as an
mm,
example of the self stigma, I want us to imagine, again, for the sake of the example,
mm,
I am diagnosed with PTSD, but I perceive then myself as weak because my family
mm,
might be saying that, for instance, I'm overreacting. Not only my family, my friends around me, my different spheres might see it as I'm overreacting. And in fact, I might have or be experiencing PTSD, but then uh, how do we say, conceptualize this as I'm weak or I'm not
mm.
coping, let alone the understanding that I'm going through something. Does this sound or ring true?
Yeah, and also it also just highlights, Ernesto, how environmental perception or societal perception can easily be internalized and become
Um,
identity, like I said. So this is self stigma. It's stigmas that you perhaps pose to yourself, but according to how you are environmentally perceived as well. We do have a couple of comments here. um okay. All right. Matume says, I once asked my male friend how they are really doing, being there for them basically, and I was labeled as weird.
Really?
Mm,
That can happen. Sometimes the label can be very different. Sometimes they can label us
mm,
as weak, gay,
mhm,
a variety of different things that might not necessarily be applicable. This then, in that case,
mm,
perpetuates the stereotype that we're trying to defeat or that we're
mm,
trying to break. That's a
mm.
brilliant comment. Thank you so much for the sensitivity in sharing it.
Matume. And Greg says traditionally male roles focused on strength, resilience, and providing. Recently, some of these traits are being questioned, with
Mm.
certain aspects now seen as problematic or at worst toxic.
Wow, toxic,
Mm,
absolutely.
mm,
That is the truth. The world is changing. We cannot. The understanding though is that this that worked for us thousands of years ago might not be applicable anymore. It might be useful, but it might not be serving us the way that life or the way that the world is looking now currently. I'm not
yeah.
too sure. That might be a contentious
And I
topic for
suppose,
debate.
yeah, maybe Greg is also touching on the fact that, historically or traditionally, like as he says, men were depicted or were expected to be providers and the people that go out there. And I'll even go as far as saying hunt and bring back the food in the house. And but right now,
Mm.
because as far as gender roles, they're very fluid. So for example, some men could even try to use their means to provide as a way to control women, and that can, as in society, be seen as toxic, the way Greg is putting it, I think. Maybe not dwelling too much on that topic, but just to highlight, perhaps this provision, this resilience, may be seen as negative in nowadays society because of how it's coming through. And then Kwena says, any suggestions on how to initiate an open dialogue to discuss issues men face without misinterpreting views and misunderstanding diverse perspectives in order to establish a safe environment? Do you want to respond to that, Ernesto?
Well, I want to mention something very much quickly and in passing. One of the
Mm,
ways in which this is being undertaken, I think it is in New Zealand or in Australia, I'm not too sure. They're having men's shed sessions. Shed as in tool shed sessions, where guys come together, they bring their broken weed eaters, their broken lawnmowers, a carburetor or two, and then we sit together trying to fix or iron out what we can do, how we can improve, what projects we might be able to, and in so doing, we get an
mm,
opportunity, a safe space to touch base
yeah.
on how we really are doing. It's had relative success where it's being implemented, and that might be something for us to see if we can adapt or adopt or implement or start. If not,
Mm.
there any variation thereof, I think might also be prudent. But one of the things that underlies the question of how do we provide that space, or how do we encourage that, is through openness and tolerance.
Definitely.
We just want to
Mm.
listen, everyone
Mm.
involved, the speakers, the listeners. We take turn in listening to each other, and we touch base on how we really are, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Easier said than done, but a good objective to put in front of us. Mhm.
I
Lovely,
agree.
lovely, lovely. Then to touch base on cultural stigma, I think uh, beyond the definitions or the different cultures, subcultures that we experience throughout the world within South Africa itself, for instance, this cultural stigma centers around a moral taint that is defined in in the context of that culture. So, for instance, what comes to mind here is how different cultures construct this tainting differently. We might find that, for instance, among Asian communities, the matter of honor and how do we say, mm, these ideals of honor and protecting your honor being so important, seeking mental health might see you as a dishonoring of your family, or a dishonor to society. And this is all speaking very broadly. In
Mm.
other, or in another kind of context, we might see that among African or Black communities, there is a general distrust towards mental health, out of the, or based on the Western origin that it might have, something that isn't necessarily applicable. I think this is where the matter of Afrocentrism, or the emerging topic of Afrocentrism in counseling, is emerging, especially in our context. Is there
Mm.
any other culture or subculture that we can maybe identify as perpetuating beliefs or perpetuating the stigma that we're talking about? Uh, I
Mm.
want to pose that to the participants. Maybe let's digest that on a little bit. As an example, psychology in itself is called a culture, and it's how we acculturate into, or how we adapt to our culture, that defines how we view a lot of ourselves, our identity, and the stigmas that we go through. Moving away though from culture, I want us to have a look at these masculine norms and stereotypes. As much as they are separate, we can start to discuss them together because of the influence that they have on one another. The first one for us to look at centers around the masculine norms, or the influence of traditional masculinity. The hegemonic masculinity we may have mentioned plays a significant role in shaping men's attitudes towards mental health. Our attitude towards mental health then defines the stigma that we experience, or the stereotypes that we formulate around it. Mm, I'm not too sure if at this point, tied in with cultural stigma, is the mistrust of the healthcare system. One of the, I'm not too sure if it's a stereotype, a large, long-standing stereotype, is that men don't like to have prostate exams
Mm.
for the invasive nature of the procedure, or for a variety of other thoughts or feelings. What do we think so far? Are there any comments along these lines or anything like that?
Not along these lines yet. Just still touching base on the previous things that we discussed. But was something that I noticed working in the medical field as well, and it still is,
Mhm.
men felt very invaded, being catered to by women. In
Mm.
the rehabilitation hospital that I worked in. So, for example, a man will have he will feel very, very demasculated, and he will feel very like his pride is being stripped away because he has to now be, his catheter, for example, has to be handled by a woman, or just the fact that he has to be seen in this vulnerable state. The expectation is that I cannot be weak. The expectation is that I cannot exude any vulnerability. So to be seen in this light takes away something, away from my manhood. I've
Mhm.
also observed that in the medical field as well. And I suppose
Absolutely.
also an example is like seeking mental health assistance as well. You find some men are very uncomfortable engaging with women as their counselors, or the people that they're receiving the service from and their assistance from. And I think it goes back to, I cannot be seen in a vulnerable state, by a woman. I suppose, if it's another man, we have, a lot of things in common, and maybe I feel safer. Can be a preference. It doesn't also. It's probably not. it's not always like a stereotype or anything like that, but it kind of also speaks to that, to say, maybe we haven't created a safe of a space as a society, women included,
Mhm.
for men to feel free enough to even seek this mental health assistance from a woman counterpart, for example. But I do want to still go through some of the comments that we did get, even though they're not necessarily along the lines we're
Of course,
discussing right now.
of course.
Um, so Peter shares, it's not good to open up in large groups. I believe the space needs to either be to either senior mentor or someone you have access to that you look up to. Okay, that's a
It
good.
sounds like a more intimate space.
Because maybe sometimes those bigger spaces may be intimidating for some people as well. Kwena says, any suggestions on how to initiate? Okay, I read that.
Mhm.
Rikesh says, I think it is also important to bear in mind that mental illness is a condition and not always just confined to what are you going through. And in many cases, it can be hereditary. That is very,
Absolutely,
very true.
absolutely.
And
Uh,
yeah,
Sorry, just to add, finances, for instance, is also something that affects us right around the board. It affects our relationships, our performance at work, our mental health as a whole,
yeah,
I'd like to say as well.
that's true. Finally, Barry says, I prefer the term mental well being to mental health.
Uh-huh.
All
Very
right.
prudent, very, very prudent indeed. That's something to work towards, I think, or to start changing the narrative. Um,
Yeah.
Absolutely, to challenge
And it
mental.
starts with conversations like these.
Absolutely. I'm also glad,
Um,
Tatu, that you brought up the stereotype of or if we could call it a stereotype, of
mhm.
men seeking assistance with female counselors. I want to speak
Hmm.
on from my own point of view. Traditionally or historically, women are associated with principles of softness, kindness, tenderness, intimacy. That generally is what helps us through our difficult times as men. So it might be the case, or I'm not too sure how the people might feel, what comments might come from it,
Mm,
that it sometimes makes a man more at ease to work with a female based on those values, based on, again, the stereotypes that we perpetuate of men ourselves. Why would I want to go through counseling with a hard and rough and tough man if what I need is a little bit of sensitivity or intimacy?
yeah, that's also a very interesting way of looking at it. So it's actually two parts. It's two sides. It's not just I
Absolutely.
hear you. Yeah, we can go ahead.
Absolutely. So moving right along, I want us to, I think this is what a lot of the people are asking about. Well, how do we move forward in a healthier way? What can we start to do? How can we
Mm,
start to take the situation by the horns, so to speak? So the first one that I think has come up throughout our conversation is the matter of vulnerability and how important it is. Uh, Besides the different, how do we say, ways in which we can be vulnerable, we understand something that's generally not so looked at is that vulnerability equals growth. We cannot grow if we're not vulnerable, for instance, with ourselves, if we're not addressing what we feel, what we're going through, and so forth. So that brings into question, into the light, the importance of vulnerability. As the point states, Indota Ikali, the statement that men
mm,
don't cry is an outdated one, one that doesn't serve us, if we could put it like that. Maybe it does to some extent, but it also perpetuates a lot of the difficulty that we go through as men. Um,
yeah.
what are your thoughts, Tatu?
Mm. And I suppose also just debunking the narrative, and is to that vulnerability means you don't have any strength as a man. You know that when you depict or showing any type of vulnerability, that it takes away from your manhood. We need to debunk those ideas and that narrative, because I believe that the two can exist in conjunction. And if anything, sometimes being vulnerable allows you to grow,
Mm,
when you are
mm,
able to cultivate and go within yourself and finding out what is, perhaps wrong, what is not right emotionally, mentally. It helps you to stretch and grow, and you could even see yourself becoming stronger, whatever the definition
mm,
is of
mm.
that word. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think this will feature further in the third point of redefining masculinity. I've made a
Mm,
little bit of a bookmark around that for us to come back to it. But the second point, just so it doesn't run away from us, is
mm,
encouraging open conversations, such as either the one we're
yeah.
having, or the tool shed sessions, or just an informal touch base between you and your
Mm,
support structure. It doesn't take a particular reason for us to reach out and say, hey, how are you doing? Sometimes we tend to argue with ourselves, why am I calling? We don't need to have a why. We can just call, depending on, again,
mm,
capacity and how we feel about it. This then, in my understanding, is what creates a culture when men feel comfortable to discuss their mental health, or their mental well-being, if we could put it that way, encouraging
yeah.
us to continue sharing our experiences and normalizing this that we're wanting to achieve. Then also, then without further ado, flowing right into it, redefining masculinity is something that we can, how do we say, take upon ourselves currently, here and the now, everyone in the presentation, as we want to challenge these stereotypes or these stigmas that have been coming from the past that, again, no longer serve us. As Tato mentioned, vulnerability, something that doesn't historically belong in the definition of a man. I would like for us to challenge ourselves or that statement and see what we can pull from it. I want us to
Mm,
consider it like this: include vulnerability in your own definition of a man and see what falls off from you. I'm
mm,
going out on a limb to say that nothing really will fall off. We will still be men.
mhm.
You will still be strong. You will still be a protector, a professor, and provider, if we could put it that way as well. But allowing for growth, growth that we may have
Yes,
been keeping from ourselves.
that's true.
Emotional expression, something that we're not taught to do, can be liberating, as mentioned by previous practitioners or other practitioners.
Mm,
Uh, the next one, tied into redefining masculinity, is being the change we want to see, or more specifically, modeling the change we want to
yes.
see. Because people tend to pick up from what we do rather than what we say. My dad always used to say, "Do what I say, not what I do." So let's start to change that rhetoric around to see if we can be the change we want to see, right? So
Mm,
this includes now the influence, for example, that we have over your children. That's every
yes.
man is very, how do we say, instrumental and very high up there when it comes to, for example, their children. That's
Mm,
one scale, but a different scale includes the the leaders, the influential characters that we have in society, public
mm,
figures, members of governance, if we could put as well, or senses
mm,
of importance. That seeing those people or those individuals challenge the ideal or becoming different or implementing these changes is inspiring and motivating for us to continue, or to perpetuate
mm.
this positivity rather than the stigma or the rhetoric. It
Yeah,
helps dismantle it. Hmm.
an example also that I heard yesterday would be Itumeleng Khune, the famous South African goalkeeper, going to social, or rather taking to social media, that when he lost his job, he actually cried for 2 weeks straight, right? He is seen as this, this example of some type of masculinity, and the strong guy, the goalkeeper of the first team. And he came and took to social media that he actually exuded some vulnerability, which, he taking it to social media, which is such a big platform as well. He modeled it, for so to
Hmm.
say, to a lot of people, but more so the younger generation, to debunk the narrative, the negative narrative or connotation around vulnerability, which is really good. So if we see more of this modeling in society, your bigger figures, um I guess, embracing vulnerability could also serve as a way to make a difference in this regard. I think
Absolutely.
maybe let's also go through. There's quite a bit of these comments so that we can continue to engage.
Absolutely.
Hope says, sorry, Ernesto, do you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to add, with when it comes to
Mm,
being that change that we want to see, I want us to focus primarily on our children because of how influential every man is when it comes to that aspect, rather than, for instance,
yes,
being a public figure or being in a position of power somewhere. You understand? We all have that value,
mm,
that importance, or that relevance right at home, if we could put it that way.
mm. Okay, so Eugene says sometimes it's good to get that good friend to check in safely. A lot of times, grabbing a drink or watching a game helps to just relax and open up and share ideas. Yes. Thank you for that, Eugene. Absolutely. Sana says men are quite stubborn in declining medical care. Women are more active in attending regular health checks. Among among Finnish men, the attitude is still that the doctor is called only when they are at their death's bed.
Yeah, that
Hmm.
tends to be a quite a common trend globally as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that insight, I think from Finland, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Sana. And then Hope says the two can coexist. Being vulnerable is actually a strength. You can both be strong and vulnerable.
Mm,
Reiterating the
mm,
points we made earlier, that's true. We can change
absolutely.
the narrative around what masculinity is defined as. And then Caesar says, speaking of moving forward, I think we can all agree that balancing life's demands while taking care of one's own mental well being can be a real challenge.
Mm.
What tips do you share with men on creating that balance?
Good question, Tato. Do you have any ideas that come to mind of
Um, a balance between mental well being and
your
life
responsibilities?
demands. Yeah.
Mm.
I
There's a
suppose we can
variety.
also, yeah, I suppose we could also look at it as something that is integrated in life and not something that you have to make time for. I think that's the problem about how we view mental well-being, and sometimes I would share with my clients just about self-care. We think
Mm.
maybe you have to make time for these things, and like it's like a free 1 hour at the end of the day or anything like that. I think it can be integrated. I think the whole point is so that these um you know debunking these stereotypes are integrated into our everyday, that you don't feel suffocated as a man when you are in the office space, like you can't say how you're feeling today, you can't share your vulnerability. It's about when you get home, are you free to just tell your wife or your kids just how you are feeling, and how in the space that you find yourself in, are you free enough to share and to open up? I don't think we should necessarily be looking at it as something that you have to put time away for specifically, but it has to be integrated into our everyday life. I don't know how you feel about that, Ernesto.
A little bit of both. Yeah, I believe there is space for routine when it comes to self-care,
Yeah.
and I also agree that we have to be intentional about it as well. Uh, I'd like to put it
Mm,
like this. Sometimes we have only one glass to pour into your responsibilities, but many responsibilities. So one way in which to tackle that balance is to either work on refilling your glass the way that it works for you in effective
that's
ways,
true.
or seeing where we can take responsibility away, to delegate, to do away with, to prioritize, if we could. We have more
Mm,
control than we're generally aware of. So exploring that might also make things a little bit easier in that regard, without being too reductionistic or too unspecific.
yes.
Just for the sake of time, let's cover this last little point on screen, the matter of addressing cultural norms. That, for the sake of our conversation, I want us to include as gender roles or gender stereotypes.
Mm,
Mm, as it mentioned there, challenging gender stereotypes by actively working against harmful stereotypes about masculinity can help create a more supportive environment for discussing mental health issues. With this in mind, I would like to pose a question to the participants. From your point of view, what constitutes a harmful stereotype about masculinity? I want to
mm,
share my own point of view, maybe to break the ice. The rhetoric that the kitchen is no place for a man, or the kitchen is where a woman belongs, is detrimental to the health of a relationship, because now we, how do we say, start transactionalizing the relationship to the point where I don't belong here, this is for you, this is for me. And we separate and create a divide that doesn't work towards, for instance, balance. I'm
mm,
not sure that that might be generic, but I want to hear from the participants what they view as harmful stereotypes about masculinity. For
mm,
example, men don't cry. That makes us bottle things in and repress ourselves and makes us carry a heavy burden. I'm not sure, that might be one of them as well. I want to hear from you guys. What do you think? I think we all stand a lot to learn from each other. I can't have gone through all the
yeah.
difficulties out there.
And I think Barry is saying there in the chats that as men and fathers, we need to work to break generational curses.
Mm,
And I agree. Some of these stereotypes that exist in society are very historic. And the context, even, were different at the time to what they are right now. We're evolving. So I think the responsibility to create new narratives falls on this generation, on us that are part of this society, and we need to continue to debunk some of these like long standing stereotypes that are so problematic, as we can see, to the mental health of men as well. Gwena shares, for the betterment of our children, the culture men
mm.
need to have amongst each other is to become better men by being better friends in order to be better fathers and life partners. Men need to support and strengthen each other. And I absolutely agree.
I would copy paste that all over the
Yeah,
place.
I
That's
have nothing to add.
brilliantly well
Definitely.
said. Absolutely. So, how can we as men start taking care of our own mental health? The
Mm,
very first point out there is to reach out for support, whether informally, formally. It means nothing about you. It doesn't say anything about your competence. It doesn't say anything about your strength. Like that video would have mentioned, I like that statement. It just means you've gone through some stuff, and
mm,
everybody goes through stuff. It's perfectly okay too. The next one that we can, when it comes to taking it upon ourselves, is to educate ourselves about mental health, what we go
mm,
through, what might be out there, what we might be seeing, what not. One of the bigger points that centers in counseling, or one of the relevant points of counseling, is how we don't know what we don't know. We have blind spots that we're not aware of until we explore, until we fill in the gaps. And the more we
mm.
do, the easier it becomes for us, I believe. We
Yeah.
also want to challenge internalized traditional masculine norms to form new beliefs about
Mm,
masculinity, not only the rhetoric, but the belief. To say that I'm a vulnerable man, but then not believe it, might not do as much benefit as I'm expecting it to for myself, for instance. Or how do we say, leaning into something different that to what society is might take a whole lot of effort, and it might take a whole lot of time, if we could put it that way as well,
yeah.
but it works. Uh, Also, sorry, to do all of this with doubt might leave us wanting, or not getting the results that we're looking for.
Mm,
Ultimately, regular check-ins, not necessarily only with your support structure, but with yourself, to find out, how am I really doing? That question that we sometimes don't know from each other. Sometimes we ourselves tend to suppress that question because of how sensitive it is to sit with the answer. It's
mm,
difficult for us to admit that I'm, for example, embarrassed about something I did in the past, or that I might be having regrets about something. And that takes,
yeah.
again, a lot of effort. Mm, let's have a look see. Tato, what do you think?
Let's have a look at the comments. Katleho says, I think that maybe once we understand that family dynamics are not the same, what works for one will
Mm,
not work for all. Yet men are held at the same standards, but they were raised differently. That is very true. Our
absolutely.
backgrounds are not the same. And our backgrounds inform the type of adults and essentially parents that we become. So they are very important, which I think it's important to then model and debunk, right, as we have been continuously saying in the conversation,
Hmm.
um, to model a way of continuing to be that does not continuously perpetuate the idea that men cannot be vulnerable, to model
Absolutely.
that as a parent so that your child does not necessarily grow up to believe these stereotypes is very important. Like I said the other day, I heard my brother saying, my little niece should not cry, my nephew, sorry, shouldn't cry because he's a boy. And he said, "Indoda ikhali, ikhalela ngaphakathi." And I had to correct that to say, no, you can cry, you're human, you are just like a girl, you have feelings, it's okay,
Mm,
cry. And shame, I think that might have been a pivotal moment for him to say, it could have been very detrimental that my brother said he shouldn't cry, and he could have harbored that as the way he should behave as a boy, right, to
mm,
just keep things in. But I suppose creating then that awareness for him to say, no, you can cry, you're human, it probably liberated him in that moment. So to model it also at that sensitive age is really important, I think. Yeah.
absolutely. Brilliantly said. Brilliantly said indeed, Tato. All of the
Mm,
points on screen, I think, are to some extent something that we may have inadvertently touched throughout our presentation, such as, for instance, normalizing the conversation by sharing your experiences. Uh, like we said, it starts
yeah,
with you. We can't expect people to now act based on what we've discussed today. So it starts by us sharing our experience, making
yeah.
ourselves vulnerable. If it works out, if it doesn't, it's not for us to, how do we say, once beaten, twice shy, but maybe the environment wasn't as safe as we thought. But it's
Mm,
for us to continue trying, helping to raise awareness for men and mental health, such as with our conversations, with any other events that might come up, with even also with our modeling and with our belief of that whole discussion.
mm,
Even if they refuse, ask them twice. This is something Tato mentioned earlier with regards to the
mm.
stubbornness of men. Men are stubborn. I speak for myself. Uh, Acknowledging if they are in a difficult situation is important, because if we're not acknowledged, we'll carry on with the way things have been. Or if we're not, how do we say, shown that things can be different, we'll continue perpetuating that rhetoric. Recognizing changes in behavior or attitude are generally easier ways to find out how we really are doing, based on that stubbornness that we may have mentioned, and again, the stigma and the stereotypes that have been perpetuated. It's a helpful point, that one. Another thing for us to have mentioned or to bring up is providing that safe space for us to share, an integral part of our conversation today, because as we understand, the environment is very important to both making and changing ourselves. And ultimately,
Mm,
to encourage men when they do share, to, how do we say again, instill the notion that it's perfectly normal, that nothing falls off from us, that it is a good normal, a healthy normal, rather than a stigmatized one or a stereotyped one. Brilliant.
yeah.
This takes us to the last point of understanding. Like, we've mentioned this before, and I just want us to reiterate. Let's be the ones who break the chains again at home, where we have the most influence. We can't go out there and change policy, procedures, society. That might be very difficult and overwhelming, but we can start making these changes gradually, and it starts with us at home. Encouraging emotional expression among our children, among boys, I think is something that will go a long way as well. Modeling positive behavior, including vulnerability, something or that we've come to equate to a strength, and ultimately challenging harmful stereotypes, whichever they might be, from culture to culture, subgroup to subgroup, or even from family to family, as you mentioned, Tato, or
Mm.
participant. Absolutely.
There's
Uh,
some interesting points that everyone is making. Is there time to go through them?
yeah, there is actually.
Okay. Um, Gogo is saying sometimes I wonder if the issue of addressing men's vulnerability is being approached incorrectly. What works as a model for vulnerability may not be effective for men. Could there be an opportunity here to develop a different model specifically tailored to men? um the fact that we have even started a conversation like this, I
Mm,
think also just opens up for more of these conversations, such as the one Gogo is posing, to say maybe the model that we are thinking about, or the model that we currently have, would not be effective for men. And I suppose continuing such conversation and delving deeper um, creates opportunities for us to look at maybe having alternative models, and something that could be a lot more effective than what we think at the moment. And Barry finally says Dr. Brent Brown is an excellent resource and has helped me massively. Oh my gosh, Barry, thank you so much for sharing that resource. Dr. Bran Brown.
Brand
Okay.
Brown. Brilliant. Thank you
Right.
so much for sharing. I do want to add
Mm,
the matter of authenticity. When it comes to redefining vulnerability among men, we may have overlooked the topic or the term of authenticity, something that has already been explored, but I think maybe prudent for a different conversation at a different time. But I do
mm,
agree also that it might be prudent to redefine vulnerability as it
yeah.
equates to men, for the sake of exactly that, for the sake of addressing that, or approaching it in a healthier kind of in a healthier way. At this point, I want us to be mindful of the fact that everybody here, whether man or woman, are human.
Mm,
We all have thoughts and feelings. We all have energy levels, and we all go through stuff, as that participant or that
yes.
video mentions.
Yes.
It's perfectly okay to be going through this. Don't carry the burden on your own. We don't get extra points for overcoming it. As men, you don't get an extra manhood card, or you don't get any more recognition for overcoming your difficulties on your own. You get the same as it would have if
Mhm.
we had to reach out, for instance. We are not more or less of men if we reach out for assistance. So I encourage us to uh, take control of ourselves, or take control of our mental well-being moving forward. On
Mhm.
screen are some of the contact numbers for social development, substance abuse helplines, South African Depression and Anxiety Group, and the National Suicide Crisis Helpline. You can feel free to make use of these resources as needed. Also, to the people, to the participants who are part of Ask Nelson, also feel free to make use of that resource either through the SMSs, the USSDs, emails, and the 24/7 availability. Again, thank you guys so much for coming. Tato, you have
Let's
a closing
continue the
remark?
conversation. Yeah, just let's continue the conversation in our small spaces. Let this not be just that webinar that you attended, but share it perhaps with the people in your circles, and let's continue this very important conversation of debunking these existing stereotypes regarding men and their mental health. Let's shift, the lens. Let's look at things differently. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just to ask for help, like that last slide said. So ask for help. If you're a man attending this, just reach out through the different resources, and there's always someone readily available to hand you a helping hand. Thank you guys for joining.
Thank
This
you
has
for
been
joining.
so nice, very
Yes,
insightful.
indeed. Thank you so much for joining and for your comments and for your engagement. It has been an insightful conversation, and I'm hoping that it starts
Mm.
here, even at the end of our conversation. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a great,
Thanks,
great afternoon,
everyone.
and all the best for the rest of your day.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ernesto and Tatuatsi. What a insightful session. I'm quite sure that we will walk away here today with some practical tools and some things that we need to think about. And I want to encourage everybody on the call. Let's keep the conversation going and let's normalize mental well-being. Thank you so much for joining
Mhm.
us. Just as a reminder, these sessions are recorded and can be located on the Kala website. And we look forward to our next session next month. Thank you so much. Take care and look after yourself.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.